Hello and welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm Jason Lowe, joined by Andrew Chow, and we are two totally ordinary Catholic guys hoping to share our journeys. Like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, we've each encountered Christ in our lives. Join us as we talk about what comes next. You might have heard that in the last couple of weeks, Pope Francis made a few headlines as he talked about civil unions. A lot was said about whether or not the Church had changed her position on same-sex marriage. Spoiler alert, she hasn't. What exactly did Pope Francis mean when he talked about civil unions and a right to a family for homosexuals? What exactly does the Church teach on homosexuality? And how do we navigate conversations with our brothers and sisters on this topic? Andrew and I hope this episode can shed some light on these questions. Hope you enjoy.
Before we get into this, can I just say that I have a huge amount of appreciation for teachers because, so I went through week 2 of my confirmation program last week.
Yeah.
And I have no idea how to handle grade 7 kids, or grade 8 kids actually. Just like going off, like, yeah, I mean, I guess we didn't figure out the intricacies of Zoom properly. So like, they just kept unmuting themselves and then like disrupting the class and whatever. And I was just, I think I was in the middle of reading a gospel passage or something.
Sure.
And I just had no idea how to handle the situation. So fortunately, the people who are actually teachers, they were just like, hey, student's name, can you please like be more respectful or like mute yourself or whatever. Like they just, with the proper amount of authority and assertion, like I was just like a deer in headlights. Like, I have no idea how to do this teaching thing, man.
It's funny because I think I had been in some situations where I dealt with like younger kids before. So like when I was in high school, I volunteered for this thing where like we taught like younger kids like to like life writing skills. And I was like, yo, I'll be great with kids, and like I wasn't great with kids. It's a different skill for sure.
It's like one of those things where it's like, oh, like it can't be that hard, and then when you actually start doing it, it's like, holy, like you really need to appreciate the people who do this full time.
100%.
It's like, man, after that class, I was like, you know, the whole thing with COVID where like people started appreciating like nurses and doctors and healthcare professionals. Like, I need to start one of these campaigns for teachers.
Yeah, honestly.
Last episode we talked about like your spiritual dryness. How are you doing with that?
A lot better. This past week has been pretty good actually. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can't really describe why. I just kind of had a bit of a rebound. And it's been interesting because it's not like I feel better, but it's just been easier to do the right things. And I think like one of the big things I realized is that like I had been focusing a lot on what I was doing versus what grace I was receiving. And then like whether I realized it or not at the time, like that was a bit of the shift, I think. And then I had a session with my spiritual director last week, and that helped me really distill like, oh, kind of this is what's going on here. And it's been pretty good since then, just kind of trucking along and kind of going with life and not being so hard on myself for the things that I do and don't do.
What do you mean when you said like you were focusing too much on what you were doing versus the graces that you were receiving?
Yeah, so it's kind of like if I didn't get to mass on a weekday, then I'd be like, oh, I didn't get to mass on the weekday versus like, just going through my day. And like, when I started to get into dryness, it was a lot of like, okay, like I need to pray more because that's what I need to do to respond to this versus like, looking for new ways to receive. So something I'm still unpacking. Turns out that my way of thinking is a heresy, but yeah, it's called Pelagianism. Anyways,
I've heard of that.
I don't think we want to dive into that, but I think Bishop Barron has a video on it that I haven't watched yet.
Yes.
But yeah, so it was cool. It was a bit of like a wake up call to be like, oh, like it's not just learning about heresy sometimes like in like the historical sense, but like knowing that like, like they were like Catholics who were trying to pursue their faith and ended up in that path.
Yeah.
And we can just as easily start thinking those ways.
It's easy.
Yeah.
It's easy. Interesting. So speaking of heresy, the last couple weeks, I think our fearless leader, Pope Francis, made some headlines, and a lot of people, including the mainstream media, wanted to jump on that. Traditional Catholics jumped on it too, and they were also like, is the Pope heretical with what he was saying? So that's what our episode is about today. We wanted to kind of dive into what Pope Francis said. If you haven't heard about it, then we'll kind of lay it out for you here, but I'm sure you probably have heard about it. And I think we just want to kind of go through it, unpack it, and see what the Pope was really saying.
Yeah.
And then maybe zoom out a bit, and because he was talking about homosexuality, so maybe zoom out a bit and talk about how the church treats homosexuality.
Yeah, definitely.
Actually, I do know for you, but for me, how I came across this news, I had a friend send me the article. I think it was a Catholic news agency article, and she was just like, "Yo, like, have you seen this? What do you think?" kind of thing. And then literally, I had a couple other friend groups who also sent an article into the group. Except, so this one article was have you heard of Lad Bible?
Mm-hmm.
So like kind of clickbaity, like not exactly your typical Catholic news source. But I mean, I guess that's how big it was in terms of the news.
6+2.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The news hitting the mainstream media. So I think, well, you told me that you had seen the headline, but I sent you the actual article.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I also have a friend send it to me. But yeah, I had seen a couple headlines, like, just like, going through work, and then you sent it over to me. And it was really interesting, I think, to interact with it, like, especially live, and to see, what were my reactions, and like, what was I going to do about it? Right?
So what was your first thought when you saw it?
My first thought was like, whoa, this is kind of big.
Yeah.
It looked pretty big. I was like, man, like, are we heading in a different direction here? Like, are there new teachings? Like, and like, the first thing I started trying to do is to try and map, if this was what he was saying, started to try and map that back. So like, what I knew about church teaching, right? Knowing that essentially, we don't change our teachings, right? As a church. So it was interesting to grapple with for a bit.
Yeah.
And then kind of diving into a little bit deeper and kind of learning a little bit more about what was actually said, kind of revealed a lot about the interactions between our faith and culture.
Yeah. I love that you said, like, cause on the surface, it was, you see the headline, even reading a bit of a few of the paragraphs, you're like, okay, like, both of us, cause me too, I was kind of like, okay, like, I mean, there's no way the church would be changing its stance on the core of this, but what actually is Pope Francis saying?
Yeah.
So, I guess I bring that up because, let alone, practicing Catholics like you and me, trying to figure this out, like, again, mainstream media kind of jumping on it. I have this one sports journalist that I follow. He works for the Toronto Star. And whenever, because this isn't the first time Pope Francis has kind of made the media or made headlines. And so whenever this kind of thing happens, he always tweets, well, he quote tweets whatever the headline is. And then he's like, cool Pope. And it's kind of like, people look at this on the surface and they're like, oh, the church is changing its direction and the winds are changing or whatever. And I think that's kind of, again, what we want to dive into today, where it's sort of like not totally necessarily is the church changing its teaching. So what exactly did Pope Francis say? And I really want to quote, so this article is from the Catholic News Agency, and I'll try to throw it into our podcast and YouTube descriptions, but I want to be really careful with what Pope Francis actually said. So I will quote him directly. And so what happened was, I think it was 2019, don't know who or what company, but there's this documentary that has been filmed named Francesco. And they did a direct interview with Pope Francis. And what he said was two things I think that people have been kind of fixated on. So the first thing is, quote, homosexuals have a right to be a part of the family. They are children of God and have a right to a family. Nobody should be thrown out or be made miserable because of it. So again, that's word for word, verbatim what Pope Francis said. And I think a lot of the confusion is, when he says having a right to be a part of the family, right? What exactly does that mean? Because the kind of immediate reaction to that is like, oh, like that's supporting, same-sex marriage and homosexuals having their own kind of family, right? But I don't totally think that's what he meant.
No, I think there's a nuance there, right? And one thing to keep in mind here is that we are quoting him, but we're quoting the English translation of what he said in, I believe it would have been Spanish. So that's another piece of the puzzle here. But definitely there's a difference, right, between starting your own family and being part of a family. Right? Think about in our nuclear family type of a deal, where I as a son am part of my parents' family versus does that mean that I've gone and started my family? There's a difference there, right? And I think that's something people jumped on.
Yeah, for sure. So two things. First thing is, you had brought up that documentary, or Pope Francis was speaking Spanish in that doc. There has been some stuff. If you're well versed with the story that's been going on the last couple of weeks, there's been some stuff about how Pope Francis was mistranslated from Spanish to English. We're not going to dive into that too much today. I don't know about your Spanish. My Spanish isn't particularly good, i.e. non-existent. So we're not going to dive into the whole Spanish versus English thing, but some of that has been out there. There are people who have been saying that he's been mistranslated. There are people that have been saying that he was actually translated correctly. So I don't think it's for us to kind of speak on that or anything. And actually, since I'm there, another thing is, we wanted to do this whole episode on the Pope Francis thing just to kind of lay out our thought process for how we came to understand this, because we're not scholars. And again, this has been the theme of our podcast the entire time. We didn't really we had our thoughts, right? Yeah. Like you said, you read the article, you tried to map it out to what you knew about the church teaching. Same thing for me. But there's no way any of this information that we have is something that we are like authorities on.
No, not anything close. I think, it's really what we want to do with this is we want to be able to share. Yeah. Like, look, we don't think that we're better or worse Catholics because of how we reacted to this, but we think that there's something about the way we have unpacked this that we want to share is really it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So going back to what you said with the whole family thing, I think that's exactly it, because Pope Francis was talking about just how, regardless of whether you have an orientation towards same-sex marriage or, traditional marriage or whatever, it doesn't mean that you should be thrown out of your family. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing to grasp, because some of the context here is, in North America, LGBTQ+, that stuff has been, it's been pretty pushed and promoted and everything. Mm-hmm. But there are parts of the world where that's actually still, outlawed, or if not outlawed, definitely severely frowned upon. Yeah. And so that particular community still experiences a lot of that persecution. And I think what the Pope is saying here is that they shouldn't have to go through that kind of, hate. Yeah. Right? And I don't think that there's anything within the Church's teachings that would contradict that.
No, definitely. It's recognizing the dignity of their humanity, regardless of what's happening here. I think, and we'll dive into, I think we have some quotes from the Catechism that's going to speak to this, but honestly, it's just the general concept of hate the sin, not the sinner type of deal, right? It's really just understanding that our predispositions, our tendencies, and those things, they're just that. They don't define us, and they shouldn't then define the way that we're treated necessarily.
Yeah. So that was the first thing that a lot of people kind of fixated on in terms of this quote from Pope Francis and having a right to be a part of the family. It's not necessarily that, getting married and then having a family kind of sense within the same-sex context, but more so just people shouldn't be thrown out of their families for this kind of thing. Yeah. I think the second quote that a lot of people have been confused about is the second one. So, what we have to create is a civil union law. That way, they being homosexuals, are legally covered. So, again, what we have to create is a civil union law. That way, they are legally covered. I think the first thing that people look at within this quote is civil union. Mm-hmm. And that was definitely the first thing that caught my attention. Mm-hmm. Now, I will say that when I first read this article, that very first day when it came across my timeline kind of thing, that was also the first thing I looked at. And it was also that particular term that I was like, this doesn't mean marriage. Yeah. Civil union, it does not contradict anything that the church teaches specifically on same-sex marriage.
Yeah, I think it's really important to, we spoke about this, right, in our second episode, I think it was, talking about the importance of marriage and what that's directed towards. And there's something different about the tie there to starting a family and the way that it points towards God, right? So speaking to things happening in the civil sense, things are up for interpretation in some senses here, but what's undeniable is that, what the Pope is going towards is protection at the end of the day, right? That's really what he's aiming for, right? That the law protects these people, that homosexuals, LGBTQ plus community is not less well served because of the way the laws are laid out.
Yeah, it was exactly the same thing with the first quote, right? In terms of by creating a civil union law, these people are legally protected from things like persecution and hate. They're not outlawed. which is all stuff that the church can totally back, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think in terms of the whole civil union term, it is a little confusing to say the least, I guess, to be fair. What does that actually mean, right? Because it's two people, again, in this context, it would be two people living together who are homosexual, but it's not the same thing as the institution of marriage,
mm-hmm.
right? The sacrament of marriage, which is, Pope Francis has actually on several occasions said that, like, there can't be any compromises there. With marriage specifically, it does have to be one man, one woman, and that's how a family is created and raised. So what I would say is that this quote, it doesn't have any kind of effect on the church's teachings on same-sex marriage. It doesn't reverse anything. It doesn't change anything. And again, as a side note, it should also be noted that this was done in a documentary,
mm-hmm.
which is not the same grounds as doing it like to change church teachings.
Yeah. So I guess, like, kind of to lay out what we mean by that, there are different levels of church teaching, right? So even when we talk about things like, what does the church teach about something? There's different levels of what that could be. Kind of going back to, you'll hear things like the catechism, right? Or things like something that's called the magisterium. And I don't think we really need to dive into that. But the point here is that there are differing levels of authority of church teaching. And, just long story short, documentary is one of them, right? When Pope Francis tweets something, it's not like people are rewriting, the rule books on the church. There are very specific, I guess, avenues and channels with which Pope Francis will share different things that are actually meant to be kind of understood by the faithful, right? So things like apostolic letters, right?
Yeah.
Things like I don't know, what else is there? When there are councils of the Second Vatican Council, it's another great example,
mm-hmm.
right, of the church gathering together to actually approach, different church teachings, and things that came out of that were new things that came out, such as what's called the Novus Ordo, which is basically just the new form of Mass compared to Latin Mass, right?
Yeah.
So things like that are church teaching, and things like this aren't.
Yeah. So a documentary does not replace church teaching, and that's hopefully people understand that at the least. But there is still kind of some amount of, like, it will make headlines when when a pope says something like this, right? And so, sorry, just one more thing on the civil union thing. I think in the context of what Pope Francis was speaking, and this was something I read in an article somewhere. Actually, I can quote that article, or source it at least. It was on patheos.com, patheos.com. It was an article by Father Matthew Schneider, who's a priest, I think, in the States with the Legionaries of Christ. And he has this really good article just kind of breaking down everything that Pope Francis said. And it's really our podcast episode, but probably much better. And so one of the things he pointed out was that within the context of civil union, especially, I think particularly back in Argentina, which is where Pope Francis is from, they wouldn't talk about, it doesn't have any kind of implications for the sexual act. Mm. So civil union can be between, I guess, two people in general, again, for the purpose of legal protection. And it doesn't actually have any kind of weight on how they behave in the bedroom. It's kind of what the article says. And so, again, this is actually, we're starting to part hairs, but it is in line with what the church teaches, because it doesn't actually have anything to do with, again, what they do in the bedroom kind of thing, when they speak about civil union. Sure.
I think at the end of the day, it's the totality of what's being declared, right? And civil union, at the end of the day, if we take a look at it from a legal sense, it's really there to change the way that the law looks at you, right? Rather than one of the big things with Catholic marriage is the open declaration of your entire being, right? Inclusive of how society looks at you and what commitments you are making as an individual as well. Yeah. So there's a lot more holistic of a statement that's being made with, I think, the Catholic marriage compared to what we're talking about here.
For more on marriage, for our thoughts on marriage, episode 2, math, marriage, and discipleship, I think. Anyway, I hope I got that right. Yeah. So I guess, on the flip side, I do want to kind of talk about what the Catholic community has been thinking about Pope Francis, right? In terms of, he's been making these headlines. And I guess the gripe that a lot of the more traditional Catholics have is that, like, things have been left to, like, people like you and me, maybe smarter, but like people like you and me to kind of have to explain these things and help set the record straight. Mm-hmm. Whereas people, I guess, when you look at the leader of the church, especially during a time where the Catholic Church is so widely persecuted anyway, people are hoping for a bit more clarity, and it kind of doesn't really feel like Pope Francis has given that clarity right away. Yeah. Again, it's been on the surface. Here's the headline. Here's a paragraph or two about what he said. And then a lot of people like you and me, and, again, more better authorities like, the articles that I quoted or the priests that I quoted, they have to come out and kind of speak on behalf of the Pope or explain the church on behalf of the Pope, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a bit of the frustration as well. And again, this isn't necessarily anything that Andrew and I are feeling, but more so just kind of laying out the ground for, what some parts of the church are feeling.
Yeah, and I think it's understandable, right? At the end of the day, when you look to your leader, people expect a certain thing. I don't think that anyone would fault any of these opinions. But I think on the flip side, you got to keep in mind that he's still a human being, mm-hmm. right? And it's not like things are always obvious. Any of us who might have said something that was misunderstood, let's say in the workplace, it's always a little bit of a man, I'm walking on eggshells here, and that's definitely the case for him, right? So I think there's a level of empathy to be had here for him as well, knowing that in this moment. Sure, he's the Pope, and granted, there's a level of expectation that comes with that role, mm-hmm. but at the same time, this was him speaking as an individual, right, rather than as a church.
Yeah.
And so, recognizing that, and that he's kind of now needing to, or being in a situation where there's a potential to explain himself as an individual again, there's a level of understanding I think we have as well.
For sure, it's a tough line to walk, because on one hand, he is his own individual, but a lot of the time when he does speak, it is for the church.
Exactly.
Right? So there's a level of empathy and understanding that we need to strive to have.
Yeah.
It's a tough balance to have.
For sure.
We had spoken earlier in terms of our thought process about trying to map what we were reading to kind of the teachings of the church. So I thought it would be a good idea for us to kind of try to break that down.
Yeah.
By quoting the Catechism, which is directly church teaching. So if you're interested, it's the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 2357. Again, I'm just going to quote it, and then we'll kind of dive into it. So, basing itself on sacred scripture, which presents homosexual acts as acts of grave depravity, tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. They are contrary to the natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a genuine affective and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can they be approved. So there's a lot here, obviously. I think one of the things when people, Catholics and non-Catholics alike, kind of zoom into is the fact that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. Mm-hmm. What does the church mean when we say intrinsically disordered?
Yeah, so I think one really important distinction to make here is the connotation versus the denotation of the word disorder, right? Where in the connotation, in the popular sense, we think of it as something is like gravely wrong in the sense that it's to be shamed, it's that type of a thing. When the denotation, which is really what the church is getting at here, is that it's not proper.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And so intrinsically disorder just means that in and of itself, it's not the way it's meant to be.
Yeah.
Is what the church is trying to say here. And I think that when we look at it from the understanding that we spoke about previously about the purpose of marriage, then it kind of makes sense why the church is saying this, because the purpose of marriage, we talked about this before, it's to be free, full, faithful, and fruitful, right? And if you can't be fruitful in this act of the conjugal act, then it is not ordered towards marriage.
Yeah.
That's really what's being said.
Exactly that. Like, it literally says they close the sexual act to the gift of life. So, and I think it should also be noted, it's not just homosexual acts that are intrinsically disordered, right? Everything outside of the marital act, every sexual act outside of the marital act would be intrinsically distorted. So that includes things like, masturbation and rape and fornication and all of those things, contraception. Yeah. All of those things also fall under that definition. So, I think it's important to kind of clarify that and make sure that people understand that the church doesn't hate the LGBTQ plus community, right? It's not just about homosexuals. It's not just about LGBTQ plus or anything. And in fact, like literally the section after Catechism number 2358, it says, the number of men and women who have deep-seated homosexual tendencies is not negligible. This inclination, which is objectively disordered, so they repeat that, this inclination constitutes for most of them a trial. So the church recognizes that this is suffering, that is difficult, it's a challenge. And she says, they must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. These persons are called to fulfill God's will in their lives, and, if they are Christians, to unite to the sacrifice of the Lord's cross the difficulties they may encounter from their condition. So, again, when Pope Francis is saying that, a civil union law must be created, that these people should not be kicked out of their families, that they have a right to their family, this is directly in line with that because, again, they must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. These are all just people, just as you said, they're all people with human dignity.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I heard spoken about previously on this topic, which I think was quite interesting, is kind of taking it, maybe taking away the actual homosexual inclination part of it, and just thinking of this as a regular and habitual tendency towards sin, regular oh my goodness. What's the word?
I don't know what word you're
Concupiscence?
Concupiscence.
Concupiscence.
Yeah.
Goodness.
Yeah.
Right. So the regular tendency towards sin that is really tough to get out of. If we think of it in that way, then it's easy enough to, first of all, relate individually. Right. So whether it be the particular sin of the homosexual act or be some other type of sin, else, right? There's that. And then just to add, I guess, a level of relatability with the church fathers. St. Paul, and I haven't fact checked this, but I heard it from a reputable source. I can't remember who it was anymore. Anyways, probably Bishop Barry.
We need to get him on this podcast.
Was that St. Paul speaks about frequently a constant thorn in his side.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Meaning that like there's this sin that he just can't get rid of. There's a sin that's just always bugging him. So this is like the apostle, right? This is the major evangelist of the church, struggling with the same sin over and over again. So this is not unique to the LGBTQ plus community, right? This is something that all of us deal with in some form or other. It just so happens that this particular sin is kind of magnified by today's culture.
It's something that my spiritual director was saying to me because, like culture and people in general, like it's so easy to become fixated on sexual sin.
Yeah.
And we get it. Like sex is it can be a sensitive topic, but it's also a beautiful thing. And when a beautiful thing like sex is twisted, then it grabs a lot of attention.
Yeah.
So we get that, but there are a lot of other sins in that are possible, I guess, that exist. Right. And so I think that's a perfect point. If we remove this whole homosexual inclination thing and just think of it as this thorn in our side, or just concupiscence in general, that's definitely something that I think can really help with the perspective here. So in terms of talking about this issue with our neighbors, our friends, our family, it can be a really difficult conversation to have, right? Yeah. I think actually last week's gospel, so we're recording this on November 1st, which is All Saints Day. But last week's gospel on October 25th, it talked about balancing our responsibility towards God and then towards our neighbors.
Yeah.
Like, how can we love God and how can we love our neighbors at the same time? And these conversations can be difficult because you take the step in the wrong direction in terms of your conversation, and you might be turning someone away from the church for a long time. You don't want to go down that path. On the other hand, you don't want to say something that is, potentially heretical or wrong, or just not faithful to God either.
Yeah. So
when we have these kinds of conversations, like, how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, it's always tough. I think one of the big things is to, first of all, praise God that this conversation is even happening. I think one of the really beautiful things with these types of topics and people coming to us as the faithful to talk about this is there is an innate openness to having a conversation.
Yeah.
Right? Whether that comes across right away or not, the fact that it's coming to light as a conversation versus a comment to themselves like, oh, finally the church is turning around, or like, oh, it's about time, means that there is a channel being opened for dialogue about our faith. And that is something to be celebrated, because as Catholics, we often talk about, it's so hard to evangelize. Well, here's evangelism kind of coming to you.
Yeah.
Right? So that's number one, to thank God for that, right? The second, I think, really important piece is to look for, in what the other person is saying, something to affirm. Because I think that that's a really good way to start from the same footing. I think if you start off with you're here and I'm here and we're going to butt heads, you're going to butt heads, right? Versus, hey, here's something about what you're saying that is very true, right? So for example, you're saying that it's good that the church is finally turning on. Well, what do you mean by that? Oh, it's good that the church isn't persecuting people. I agree. Yeah. It's good that we're not persecuting people, and maybe that's an oversimplified example, but I think that's a really important.
No, that's where a lot of these conversations start.
Yeah.
And
then from there, it's just kind of exploring the topic together. I think understanding, what is it that you're excited about as an individual? What is your interpretation of what is being said? And then what is my interpretation? And then exploring that together, right? I think if you start from the same place and you explore together, I think there's a lot of openness in general to find the truth. And if the conversation is about finding the truth, I find that we tend to have a good conversation, even if we end up in different spots. It's a good conversation versus if we're trying to educate the other person and not now pursuing the truth, then you'll tend to have a little bit more of a maybe less helpful conversation.
I think it's also important to remember that you can't bring someone to the truth in one night, right? You can't just set out and be like, okay, within the matter of 3 hours, this will be done, and this person's going to be a converted Catholic or something. Like that's not the point. If anything, actually, it's just understanding that you might have a role. God might be using you as an instrument. He might be planting a seed, but also you just might not be. And either of those things should be fine. Right. You shouldn't go and set out to have a conversation for the purpose of like converting souls. And like the zeal is great, right? If you're on fire with the Holy Spirit to evangelize and you really want to bring people to heaven and all the people around you, like that is a beautiful thing. But I think there's always a balance with these kinds of things where you don't want to turn someone away from the church. You want to, as you've been saying, find that common ground and have proper open dialogue and conversation. If it leads somewhere, that's great. If not, God is probably going to use someone else down the road in that person's life to bring them closer to Him. Right?
Yeah. This one I know Bishop Aaron talks about. In particular, with a slightly different context, he talks about bringing the youth back to church. And what he says there is that, today's youth are really on fire with pursuing social justice. And then what he maps it to is like, well, the church has lots of social justice going on. So why don't we put that in front of the youth first? And then what he basically says from there is like, look, all the people that are going to say like, why aren't we starting with transubstantiation? It's kind of like a calm down, we'll get there, but let's start a conversation first. Right. So I think that's kind of the pieces, meet the other person where they're at. Don't presume that you know where they should go next right away.
Yes. Yeah, that's so important. You need to make sure you're truly seeing them for where they are.
Exactly.
Is there anything else you want to cover on this, or?
I don't think so. I think, just to recap what we've talked about here, really, it's a combination of one, we had some pretty crazy reactions to this too. And if any of you listening also had some like big reactions and you're like, oh man, like, was that heretical? Like, it's okay, your reactions are your reactions. What's more important is what you did after that, right? And if you did pursue things, great. If you hadn't had that chance to yet, then do it, right? We definitely encourage you. There's lots of resources out there. Lots of priests have commented on this at this point. And make sure you fact check and find reliable sources, right?
I'm going to stop you right there. Yeah. So like just the sources that we kind of checked. Again, I quoted that Catholic News Agency article. I think there's maybe 2 or 3 of them on that website at this point. Pathos.com, I already quoted. There are 2 articles, I believe, that I've seen written by Father Matthew Schneider, again, Legionaries of Christ. I also saw a reaction video by Dr. Tim Gray, if you know him. I think he teaches somewhere in the States at the St. Augustine Institute or something like that. Anyway, the video is on Formed. So if you have a subscription to Formed through your church or personally, you can check that out there. It's like on the front page. Formed is basically Catholic Netflix. I love it. And then, yeah, also there's a Matt Fradd. He's another kind of authority within the Catholic Church in terms of just he's a lay person and he goes around speaking on various subjects. So Matt Fradd is someone that I've also listened to. You're a spiritual director. Also my dad, who has a master's in theology. I definitely leech some of his thoughts as well. So yeah, like it's just like you said, if you haven't quote unquote taken action yet or dug into this, or maybe this is the first time you've heard of it, like there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe this episode, the information in this episode is enough for you. Maybe you want to dig a bit deeper, right?
Yeah, definitely. And then from there, the only other thing that we really have to say is, when people come to you and talk about this, celebrate that conversation and let it go where it's meant to go, right? Don't presume, to try and drive the conversation necessarily, right? We each had our reactions. You'll have your reaction, they'll have their reaction, and everyone processes things at different speeds, right? So I think it's praising God to have the opportunity to be a part of that unpacking and to be open to be part of that however you're meant to.
And just last thing is just prayers. I think this is a huge thing. Prayers for the Pope, prayers for the leadership within the Catholic Church, because even I think just before this episode, you and I both saw this headline. I don't know if you still have it up. It was like Archbishop. Do you have it?
Yeah, it says Archbishop grapples with Pope's confusing same-sex union stance. And this is like a perfect example of the over-romanticization of what actually happened. Because even from a skim through of this article, what you'll see is that the actual quote says basically, the Pope should probably clarify his comments. And like from this bishop saying that, it's like, oh, he's grappling with how confusing it is. Like, okay, well, let's calm down a little bit here, right? And that's just one example of how media has taken things, has blown things up a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. So prayers for our leadership, and prayers for the Catholic Church as well. All right, I think that wraps everything up today. It's a bit of a weightier subject, but I think it was really informative. Again, we just wanted to lay out our approach to unpacking this, because you can't just take things at the surface level these days. In general, but yes, especially with something like this as well. So, all right, so I think that's all for us today, and you'll hear from us next time.
Stay safe, everyone.